Buried beneath the sands of time lies a kingdom few dare to remember. It had no gold mines, no emerald hills, no oceanic trade routes, only a debt to its gods and a cruel currency with which to pay it. Children. Every harvest season, a number was whispered into the ears of trembling families, a tally known only as the blood tax. One child for every sun-blessed field, one for every bountiful river, one for every breath of peace the gods allowed. And so, parents gave them up. Boys, girls, it didn't matter. As long as their blood ran warm and their hearts still beat. They were marched, sometimes drugged, sometimes screaming, to ancient altars and blackened caves. There, they became payment. Not to kings, not to emperors, but to forgotten gods, whose names were never spoken aloud. This wasn't mythology. This was policy. Government-issued sacrifice, enforced with priestly knives and royal decrees. What kind of world lets this happen? You're about to enter a place where fear wore a crown, religion demanded obedience, and innocence was the most valuable commodity of all. This is the horrifying, true story of a kingdom that taxed its people in blood and paid in children. Welcome to the forgotten empire of child sacrifice. Now let's go back to where it all began. Hidden deep within the valleys of what is now modern-day North Africa, far from the well-known civilizations of Egypt or Carthage, there once lay a kingdom so secretive, so thoroughly erased, that even its ruins are hesitant to speak. It was called Tartessos by outsiders, but its own people knew it as something else. A name forbidden to write. A name tied not to land or bloodline, but to covenant. Archaeologists once believed it was a myth, a fictional blend of Phoenician tales and local folklore. But in the 1970s, beneath a scorched plateau in southern Spain, scattered remnants were unearthed. Obsidian ceremonial blades, altars stained with what analysis revealed to be human hemoglobin, and a single inscription carved into black stone. To the gods of the deep sky and the bitter flame, we offer the fruit of our flesh. At first, the find was dismissed. Too bizarre, too impossible. But as more digs continued, the evidence grew undeniable. A thriving kingdom had once stood here, complex, wealthy, and completely ruled by a theocracy. A state where the priesthood didn't just advise rulers. They were the rulers. And their sacred text, the so-called Codex of Breath, outlined a system of divine reciprocity. Every blessing from the gods had to be paid for. Rain, harvest, victory, fertility, peace. Each came with a cost. A blood cost. A life cost. The earliest rituals began with animals. Goats, calves, birds. But then, something shifted. Droughts worsened. Crops failed. And when the skies turned hostile, the priests turned inward. Their solution? Sacrifice what was closest to the gods, the purest, most innocent forms of life. Children. It started with the royal families. Princes and daughters of the elite were offered to demonstrate loyalty and set precedent. But over time, the ritual bled into the public. A system was created. Every family had to register births. Census records became grim tools of spiritual accounting. If your village had a good harvest, you owed. If your herds were fertile, you owed. And the payment wasn't in grain or coin. It was in sons and daughters. This wasn't chaos. It was organized, enforced, ritualized. Every third moon, a procession would be led by white-robed priests through the villages. They would read aloud the quota, marked by celestial charts and blood-inked scrolls. Some children were taken without resistance. Others were hidden. Some families tried to flee. But escape was rare, and rebellion even rarer. Because the people truly believed. They believed their survival depended on these offerings. That the gods demanded blood, and without it, the earth itself would rise against them. And so, the kingdom thrived, built not on trade, but on terror disguised as devotion. For centuries, no outsider knew of its existence. Those who stumbled upon it either joined its cultic machinery or were never seen again. But whispers eventually made their way into Phoenician ports. Travelers returned with stories of temples with walls that wept red and rivers that ran strangely warm after ritual nights. Rome, too, heard the rumors, and what they heard chilled even their imperial spine. But the truth wasn't just hiding in the rituals, it was embedded in the state. Every law, every tradition, Every building was constructed with one purpose: to feed the gods and preserve the kingdom through sacrifice. Yet no kingdom can survive forever, not even one soaked in blood. And what was coming would test the faith of even the most devout. In most ancient civilizations, kings ruled by sword or law. But in the blood-soaked kingdom of Tartessos, power came from a darker source: proximity to the divine. The high priests were the true monarchs, men veiled in crimson robes, their faces hidden behind masks carved from the skulls of extinct beasts. Each priest was both a ruler and a servant, a mouthpiece for the gods and the architect of human sacrifice. They were known as the caretakers of the flame. These men didn't claim political authority. They claimed divine appointment, each selected by prophecy, dreams, and signs said to come directly from the gods. Their decisions were unquestionable. Their punishments, final. To defy a priest was to defy the will of the gods. And the gods were always hungry. Tartessian theology revolved around a pantheon of unknowable entities. Not humanoid deities like those of Greece or Egypt, but cosmic forces, beings of hunger, lightlessness, and flame. Chief among them was the Mash, a god never depicted with a face, only with a burning spiral descending into a pit. He was called the mouth beneath the world. The people believed the Mash lived beneath the earth, and that his hunger was endless. If unfed, he would swallow their crops, poison their rivers, and consume their children anyway, through famine or plague. So better to give the child willingly than to lose the entire family. Temples weren't places of worship, they were feeding stations. Every one was built around a pit, usually carved from volcanic rock, surrounded by elaborate obsidian mosaics depicting suffering, transformation, and rebirth through agony. The priests would descend into the temples once a month during the night of sorrow, carrying chosen children wrapped in white linen, their faces painted with soot. No one but the priests ever entered the sanctum during these nights. No outsider ever witnessed the act itself, but everyone heard it. Villages would grow silent as dusk fell, fires extinguished, doors barred. And then, from the black mouths of the temples, came the screams, brief, high, and unmistakably human. Sometimes they were followed by chanting, sometimes by silence. Always, they ended with drums. The next morning, the priests emerged, their robes stained, their eyes downcast. They would mark the walls with red pigment, symbols to indicate whether the gods had accepted the offering. If the symbol glowed in the morning sun, an effect achieved with a mysterious phosphorescent mineral, the sacrifice was accepted. If not, a second procession was called. More children, more blood. And so, the people watched those walls in terror, praying for a single glowing glyph. The kings, those nominal rulers allowed to live in luxury, were nothing more than puppets, ceremonial figureheads who existed to show allegiance to the priesthood. Their sons were often the first to be sacrificed in times of crisis. A public show of loyalty and a chilling reminder: no one was above the blood tax. There was no rebellion, no coup, no uprising in these early years. The system was too deeply ingrained, too spiritually enforced. The people weren't oppressed in the traditional sense. They were believers. They had been raised in a world where pain was holy, where loss was sacred, and where gods did not love, they consumed. And for a time, it worked. Crops grew, rain came, disease was rare. The land seemed to respond. But then, something changed. A new star appeared in the sky, red, flickering, and slow-moving. The priests called it a sign. The Mash was stirring. His hunger was growing. And the blood tax would rise. When the blood tax rose, it wasn't just a decree, it was a visitation. They came in the dead of night, without warning. No horns, no heralds, just the dull thud of sandals on dirt and the flash of torchlight against painted bone masks. These were the collectors, a special order within the priesthood, feared more than death itself. Unlike the high priests, who spoke in riddles and ceremony, the collectors had one purpose: to take. They traveled in groups of 3, each one draped in cloaks dyed with the sap of the bloodwood tree, a red so dark it looked black. Their faces were always covered, even when speaking. No one knew their names. To speak to one directly was to invite misfortune. To refuse them was unthinkable, because the collectors didn't just take the children the temple had marked. They took any child they wanted. Sometimes they came for a boy who had just reached the sacred age of 7, considered the age of choice, when the soul was said to be most valuable. Other times, they would take infants. On rare occasions, they would take girls during the full moon, believed to be more potent offerings during celestial alignments. The criteria were never explained, only whispered about. A birthmark shaped like a spiral. Families blackened their homes, buried mirrors, and told their children never to look a priest in the eyes. But silence wasn't always enough. There were cases where the collectors came for multiple children in a single home. Twins were considered especially dangerous to leave alive, an insult to the gods' demand for singular sacrifice. Both would be taken. The parents left with nothing. The priests called it balancing the scale. Some families, desperate to avoid the inevitable, resorted to unthinkable choices. They maimed their own children, cutting off fingers or blinding them, hoping the gods would find them unfit. But this only enraged the priesthood. A maimed child wasn't exempt. It was an offering defiled. These children were still taken, usually with brutal public punishment for the parents, who were often nailed to the temple gates as a warning. The message was clear: you do not bargain with the gods. Those who cooperated were treated with grim reverence. Their names were sometimes added to temple scrolls, listed as families of the flame. They were given blessings, fertile lands, protection, even high-status funerals. But the pain never left them. Grief became holy, suffering sacred, and still the priests collected, season after season, generation after generation. But the real horror was not in the act of taking. It was in the rituals of preparation. Once selected, children were taken to a secluded compound outside the city known only as the Quiet House. No one outside the priesthood had ever seen inside. No one ever returned from it. But fragments of scrolls, uncovered centuries later in caves near Cadiz, suggest chilling routines. The children were kept in silence for 13 days, fed only specific herbs meant to cleanse the blood, bathed in ice-cold water infused with volcanic ash. They were taught a single prayer, whispered over and over until it was the only thing they knew. On the final night, they were dressed in garments made from the hair of previous sacrifices, woven by temple virgins who had taken vows of silence from birth. Then came the procession. At dawn, the gates of the Quiet House opened. The children emerged, pale, slow, and empty-eyed. They walked alone, flanked by priests, toward the temple. And the people watched, not because they wanted to, but because to look away was considered a denial of the gods. These rituals were passed down, generation after generation, not through books, not through scrolls, but through fear. And yet, cracks were beginning to form. Whispers in the market, secret carvings behind doors, a growing realization, even among the faithful. If the gods demanded this much, were they truly gods at all? The Temple of Offering was the heart of Tartessos, a structure so massive and so ominous that even the surrounding hills seemed to bow before it. Carved into the side of a volcanic ridge, its black stone exterior reflected no light, giving it the appearance of an unnatural void carved into the earth. No outsiders ever entered willingly. Only the priests. Only the children. But over centuries, through the accidental discoveries of crumbled walls, charred manuscripts, and fragments of forbidden scripture, a picture has emerged, a partial, chilling map of what lay inside. The entrance, known as the Veil, was guarded not by soldiers but by carvings, rows of child-sized figures with mouths sewn shut, etched in contorted, lifelike detail into the obsidian walls. According to recovered texts, the veil was said to swallow memory, meaning that once you passed through, your past no longer mattered. You were not a name, not a soul, just an offering. The interior layout followed a sacred geometry, concentric circles aligned with celestial events, solstices, and planetary cycles. The architecture wasn't meant to please human senses. It was meant to summon. The walls were embedded with reflective minerals and strange ores that seemed to glow when blood touched them. In the center was the altar, and below it, the pit. Known as the Maw of the Mash, this was the epicenter of the ritual, a black, bottomless shaft that descended into the earth, said to connect the mortal realm to the domain of the gods. No torch could light its depths. No rope had ever reached the bottom. When offerings were made, they were not buried. They were lowered into the pit, alive. The ritual was known as the descending gift. It began with music, low, atonal droning from instruments made of hollowed human femurs and dried animal gut strings. The priests would surround the altar, chanting in a language that, to this day, remains undeciphered. Linguists call it the dead dialect, a tongue found nowhere else in human history. Then came the child, led to the altar, not forced, but gently guided. By the time of the ritual, the children were no longer resisting. Whether due to drugs, indoctrination, or the quiet house's psychological torment, they went willingly, their faces blank, their feet bare, their bodies trembling. The priests painted symbols on the skin using a crimson pigment made from crushed insects and iron-rich clay. These glyphs were said to mark the soul for passage. They were never repeated. Every symbol was unique, crafted specifically for each sacrifice, designed by a priest called the Blood Architect, whose only role was to divine what sigil would please the gods. Then, the child was offered, sometimes through blade, sometimes through fire, sometimes through nothing at all. There are accounts of children simply walking to the edge of the pit and falling in, arms outstretched, their faces radiant with ecstasy or horror. The priests claimed that the gods would decide their fate directly. What lay at the bottom of that pit? Some believed it was a massive chasm of heat and smoke, a volcanic vent sanctified by ritual. Others claimed it was something far stranger, that it was alive, that it pulsed, that it moved. There are stories, written in cracked tablets found in nearby villages, that tell of the pit screaming back, of the earth rumbling when an offering was denied, of voices rising from the depths, speaking in languages no man should understand. But the most terrifying detail? The echo. Each time a child was lowered into the pit, their voice would rise in a final sound. A scream, a song, a prayer, something primal. And then, nothing. But moments later, a new sound would return. It was never the same. Sometimes it was laughter. Sometimes it was weeping. And sometimes it was a voice that didn't belong to the child at all. The priests called this the echo of acceptation, a sign that the gods had consumed the offering and were momentarily appeased. This process continued for centuries, untouched, unquestioned. But deep within the priesthood itself, doubts were festering. One ritual went wrong. A child was lowered, and no echo came back. The room remained silent. Days passed, then weeks, and strange phenomena began to ripple across the kingdom. Stillbirths in record numbers. Plagues of insects that died as soon as they landed. Rivers turning black without explanation. The priests declared it a sign of hunger unsatisfied. And the response? Double the sacrifices. Over the following moon cycle, over 200 children were taken, the largest single offering in the kingdom's known history. But the pit remained silent. And fear, real fear, began to infect the priesthood. Because if the gods were no longer answering, what had they awakened instead? For centuries, Tartessos was a sealed world, hermetically enclosed in ritual, fear, and blind devotion. Generations were raised to believe the blood tax was sacred, necessary, even merciful. But belief is brittle, especially when silence becomes too heavy to bear. And it began, as all great ruptures do, with a whisper. In a small river village called Talhessa, located on the edge of the kingdom's jurisdiction, a midwife named Ashima refused to report a birth. It was a simple act, one line left unwritten in the royal census. The child, a girl, was hidden in the cellar beneath woven mats and jars of olive oil. For 7 years, she lived beneath the floorboards, hearing her mother's voice only through cracks in the planks. But children don't stay hidden forever. She was discovered during a routine census audit by a visiting priest who noticed an extra pair of shoes drying by the fire. Ashima was arrested. Publicly. Brutally. She was paraded naked through the streets, her tongue cut out, then burned alive beneath the crescent moon, a symbol of cleansing through divine fire. But before her execution, she did something the priests had never anticipated. She wrote. Carved into the wooden beam of her cell were the words, "A God who demands children is no God at all. It is a beast." Those words spread like wildfire. Other midwives, keepers of life in a kingdom obsessed with death, began their own quiet defiance. Forged documents, falsified deaths, taught women secret herbs that could prevent conception or end pregnancies quietly. before the census ever saw them. The priesthood responded with terror, burning libraries, executing entire families on suspicion of concealment, and establishing a new elite unit known as the Eaters of Falsehood, priests trained in interrogation, torture, and dream divination, who hunted down dissent with religious ferocity. But suppression only fed the resistance. Small groups formed across the outer provinces, disparate, disconnected, yet eerily similar. Some carved secret symbols under doorframes. Others recited Ashima's words during childbirth. These groups called themselves the Breathless, in honor of the children who had screamed into the pit, only for their voices to vanish. And then, a miracle happened. A child was taken and returned. Her name was Nima, age 10, chosen during the mid-harvest procession. Witnesses saw her walk, barefoot, to the quiet house. They saw her robed, silent, led to the temple. She should have vanished like all the rest. But 3 days later, she emerged. Alone, covered in blood, barely able to speak. She was found wandering in the hills by a shepherd who hid her for weeks before smuggling her to a village sympathetic to the breathless. When she finally spoke, her words cracked the priesthood's illusion. They were feeding something down there. But it's not a god. It's alive. It talks. It asked me to stay. The girl described no afterlife, no divine warmth, only a voice in the dark. One that called her by name. One that promised she would never be alone again if she just jumped. She refused. The priests claimed the girl was a liar, a demon, a trick sent to test faith. They offered a reward for her death. But the breathless hid her, protected her, and began to record her story on cave walls, bark, and ash tablets. It was the first time in centuries anyone had publicly challenged the theology of Tartessos. And it broke something loose. More children were hidden. Some priests began defecting. Secret meetings took place at night, beneath the abandoned aqueducts and in salt caves near the sea. Plans were made, not just to resist the tax, but to destroy the temple of offering itself. It would not be easy. The temple was guarded by a fanatical sect known as the Daughters of Flame, warrior priestesses trained from birth to kill for the altar. Every entrance was fortified, every passage trapped, and the pit, whatever it contained, was still being fed. But for the first time in centuries, the people no longer feared the gods. They feared what they had created in their name. The fire had been lit, and now, rebellion stirred beneath the surface like magma waiting to burst. Because if children could survive the pit, then the gods could bleed. The priesthood had always controlled the written word. Their sacred texts, their blood-stained laws, even their historical records, all were kept under lock, inside the vast subterranean libraries of the capital city, Halimtar. No outsider was allowed to read them. Not scribes, not kings, not even other priests outside the inner circle. Knowledge, like sacrifice, was rationed. But history has a way of leaking through cracks. The first true fracture came when a young apprentice priest named Keller smuggled out 3 parchment scrolls from the Archive of Sorrows, one of the most secure vaults in the temple complex. He didn't do it out of rebellion. He did it out of horror. The scrolls weren't stories or hymns. They were ledgers. Cold, meticulous records of every blood tax paid for nearly 500 years. Thousands of names, ages, dates, methods of offering, reactions from the pit, and in the margins, red-inked notes in a spidery hand. Repeated phrases. Not enough. No echo. Unsatisfied. There, a new leader had emerged. Marish, a former royal historian exiled for writing a poem that questioned the gods' appetite. Together, they began what became known as the Forbidden Chronicles, a painstakingly curated archive of everything the priesthood had buried or burned. The chronicles were copied onto animal skins, pottery shards, even pressed into clay and baked underground, hidden across dozens of locations. Each fragment contained names, dates, symbols, and something else, accounts of other survivors. Nima wasn't the only child who had returned from the pit. Over a span of 200 years, there were 8 others, each recorded in the ledgers as rejected offerings. Only 2 were executed immediately. The others were taken back into the quiet house, never seen again. The chronicles suggested the priesthood wasn't just sacrificing children. They were studying the pit, documenting its reactions, measuring its hunger, tracking patterns. Some offerings disappeared instantly. Others screamed for hours before silence. A few, horrifyingly, returned after days, but changed. Different. One scroll described a boy who came back blind, teeth missing, yet smiling. He spoke in languages no one taught him, and painted spirals on the walls with his own blood. He begged to be let back in. They sealed him alive beneath the temple. This revelation shattered the rebel ranks. Until now, they had seen the blood tax as cruelty disguised as religion. But these chronicles revealed something far worse: deliberate experimentation. The priesthood wasn't serving the gods. They were feeding and studying something far older, far darker, and perhaps not divine at all. And then they found the first tablet, carved in basalt, dated at least 1,000 years before the founding of Tartessos, written in a proto-language later identified as pre-Canaanite. It read, "It fell from the sky in flame. We buried it in the earth. It speaks through flesh. It eats what we love." Beneath it, a crude drawing, a pit. And beside the pit, a spiral with 3 eyes. It was not a god. It was an entity. An ancient intelligence worshipped before language itself, known by 1,000 names, feared by those who found it, and in Tartessos, mistakenly enshrined as a deity. The priesthood had inherited its prison, and over generations, confused containment for worship. The pit wasn't a portal to heaven. It was a mouth, a door, a wound, and every child thrown into it was making it wider. The forbidden chronicles spread across the rebel factions, hidden in caves, under floorboards, behind false walls and homes. Families memorized pages. Daughters tattooed symbols onto their thighs. Sons carved warnings into tools, weapons, furniture. The truth had escaped. And for the first time in history, belief was no longer the glue of the kingdom. It was a toxin. The breath of revolution thickened. But the priests weren't blind. They had seen the signs, the lost offerings, the silence from the pit, and they knew the entity was waking. The rain stopped. The rivers shrank into cracked veins across the earth. Livestock dropped dead with empty bellies and foam-ringed mouths. Disease swept the outer provinces like a whispering plague. Crops blackened under skies thick with ash, not volcanic ash, but something stranger, fine as dust, with a faint shimmer in the moonlight. To the people, it was judgment. To the priests, it was prophecy. The blood architects pored over ancient glyphs. The pit had gone quiet again, too quiet. The echoes had ceased. No more screams. No voices rising back from the maw of the mash. Only breathless silence. It was taken as a terrifying sign. The gods were not simply hungry. They were awakening. And so, the priesthood did what it had always done when faced with fear. It escalated. The Grand Conclave of Flame was called. A council not summoned in over 400 years. High priests, masked initiates, daughters of flame, and the last of the line of kings, all gathered in the shadow of the temple. What emerged from that meeting would become the darkest chapter in Tartessian history. The blood tax was no longer enough. Now, entire villages were to be offered. The decree was written in black flame ink and posted at every border, every temple gate, every well-traveled road. Let the people repay their ancient debt. Let the earth be fed, one village, each fortnight, until the gods return their breath. Each selected village was given 3 days' notice. Enough time to prepare offerings. Enough time to panic. Not enough time to run. On the 4th day, the collectors arrived, not in threes, but in dozens. Accompanied by the daughters of flame, now dressed for war. Homes were burned. Survivors herded like cattle to the temple. And one by one, they were cast into the pit. Children, parents, elders. No longer chosen. No longer prepared. Just thrown. And the pit began to stir again. It responded, not with echoes, but with movements. The ground shook. The obsidian altar cracked. The phosphorescent glyphs that once marked acceptance now glowed constantly, even in daylight. Animals near the temple were found twisted, eyeless, still alive, but changed, spines malformed, teeth missing, tongues fused. But the priesthood didn't stop. The sacrifices accelerated. 10 villages in 30 days. Then 20. Then 30. Tartessos, once a land of ceremonial horror, now became a machine of extermination. The priesthood believed they were purifying the kingdom, returning it to spiritual balance. In truth, they were feeding a growing horror they could no longer control. And still, the breathless resisted. Their ranks swelled with surviving villagers. Entire battalions of defectors joined, former guards, scribes, even young acolytes who had seen too much. Armed with the forbidden chronicles and driven by vengeance, they launched their first assault on a sacred site. The Temple of Tears, a secondary sacrificial ground, was burned to the ground in a single night. Its priests slaughtered, its pit sealed with molten iron, its glyphs defaced with blood and ash. It was the first successful rebellion in Tartessian history. The priesthood responded with what they called the Scouring, a month-long purge of any suspected rebel sympathizer. Children were questioned, parents tortured, homes turned to cinders. But the rebellion had already passed a point of no return, because something inside the pit had noticed. Across the kingdom, strange phenomena began to surface. A child in the mountains who spoke backwards for 3 days before dissolving into dust. A woman in the capital who levitated above the temple steps and screamed the names of 8 future victims before her heart exploded. Dreams that infected whole villages, identical nightmares of a spiraled mouth opening in the sky. The breathless interpreted these as signs that the entity was no god. It was a conscious force, reacting, evolving, manipulating, and that every sacrifice only strengthened it. Marish, now the de facto leader of the movement, made a desperate declaration. We must seal the pit, not for our children's future, but to save the earth from what lies beneath. Plans were drawn, suicide missions plotted. A team of rebels, including surviving architects and defected priests, would infiltrate the Temple of Offering. Their mission was not to fight. It was to bring the end, to collapse the temple, to bury the mouth, to cut off the entity from its food and from this world. But they had no idea what they would find inside, because by then, the pit was no longer a hole. It had begun to rise. The plan was desperate, reckless, possibly suicidal. But for the breathless, it was the only hope left. They couldn't stop the blood tax. They couldn't convince the faithful, but they could end the source, even if it meant obliterating themselves in the process. The operation was codenamed Ashmouth. 15 rebels, former masons, defector priests, and warriors who had once guarded the temple. They carried with them not swords, but knowledge, blueprints of the Temple of Offering smuggled from the old royal archives. Their goal was simple: reach the central support columns beneath the altar, place iron barrels filled with pitch, saltpeter, and oil, ignite them during the offering ceremony, when the temple would be filled with priests, worshippers, and, most importantly, the entity's focus. The infiltration began under cover of night. Disguised as pilgrims, the rebels joined a procession of grieving families on the eve of a massive sacrifice, an entire village marked for offering. Over 300 people, the largest blood tax in recorded history. The breathless moved with silent precision. They passed through Veil Gate, entered the inner sanctum, descended into the foundation womb, the oldest part of the temple, where magma-heated vents and narrow passageways coiled beneath the obsidian floor. They planted the charges. They said their goodbyes. And they waited. At dawn, the sacrifice began. Drums, chants, screams. The same grim performance, now industrial in scale. The high priest, draped in spiraling red cloth, raised his arms to the pit. The offerings were led forward. The people wept. And then, fire. The explosions were deafening. The obsidian altar cracked in half. Support beams collapsed. The great dome split open, vomiting black smoke and falling ash. The crowd scattered in chaos. Priests burned alive. The platform caved in, and with it, the pit. For a moment, it seemed the impossible had happened. The Temple of Offering, destroyed. But what came next was worse than any ritual. From the broken pit rose a sound no human throat could mimic. A high-pitched whine, followed by a rumble. Then laughter. Not joyous. Not angry. Mocking. Then the ground buckled. From beneath the cracked earth, something emerged. Not a body, not a beast, but a form, a shifting, roiling spiral of flesh and smoke and mouths. Eyes that blinked sideways, teeth where there should be none. It didn't move in space, it unfolded through it. It wasn't rising, it was uncoiling. It had never been asleep. It had never been buried. It had been growing. The rebel survivors screamed. Some ran, others fell to their knees. One man clawed out his own eyes and whispered, "It was never a god. It was a mirror." The entity pulsed once, and the sky cracked. Not metaphorically, literally. A seam of lightning tore through the atmosphere, spreading outward like shattered glass. The air grew thick. Metal twisted. The temple ruins began to rise, not collapse, reverse collapse, as if time itself was being undone. The villagers meant for sacrifice began to walk toward the pit, eyes empty, feet bloody, chanting a phrase that hadn't been spoken in generations. The mash, the mash, the mash returns. The priests, those few who had survived, fell to the ground in worship, weeping tears of joy. One tore open his chest and whispered, "We fed it enough." Then came the massacre. The entity didn't strike with fire or lightning. It spoke. One word. Unintelligible. Non-human. And those who heard it exploded. Blood vaporized. Skulls shattered. Skin split open like ripe fruit. Over 700 people died in under 3 minutes. Some by sound. Some by light. Some by nothing at all. And still, the villagers marched toward the pit, their bodies falling in, one by one, like stones into a well. By sunset, the temple was gone. Only a crater remained. The rebellion had failed. The breathless were either dead or scattered, their hopes buried beneath a silence more absolute than ever before. And yet, something had changed. The entity did not expand. It did not consume the kingdom. It withdrew, back into the earth, back into the pit, silent once more. Why? No one knew. But one surviving rebel, a child no older than 12, scrawled a message in charcoal on a broken wall days later. It doesn't want the sacrifices. It wants the worship. It was never fed by blood. It was fed by belief. The priests would rebuild. The blood tax would return. But something in the people had died that day. Something even the gods couldn't resurrect. The years that followed the massacre were unlike anything Tartessos had experienced before. Not because peace returned. Not because the sacrifices stopped. But because the people had ceased to believe. It began with silence. Not defiance. Not open revolt. Just a heavy, deafening absence of faith. No more prayers whispered in the fields. No more kneeling before the veiled priests. Children still disappeared, yes, but their names were no longer offered willingly. Their parents did not cry out to the gods for mercy. They wept in silence and stared. The priests rebuilt the temple of offering, brick by blackened brick. They declared the rebirth of a holier, purer Tartessos. They declared the return of the mash, restored by blood and fire. They declared that the entity had spoken through devastation and had now forgiven them. But they were wrong. Nothing answered. The pit remained still. No echoes. No laughter. No signs. It was as if the god had eaten its fill and turned its back. And worse, the land began to rot. Famine took hold. Salt poisoned the rivers. Fish floated belly up by the thousands along the coast. Crops withered even under rainfall. The animals refused to breed. Miscarriages tripled. This time, no ritual worked. No blood tax, no prayer, no glyph drawn in sacred ash. And still, the priesthood refused to stop. They called for a final offering. One more sacrifice to wake the gods, to restore the balance, to end the silence. But this time, they went too far. They demanded every firstborn child from every family across the kingdom. No exceptions, no exemptions, not even among the priesthood themselves. They called it the reckoning. And the people, numb from grief and hollow from fear, simply stood still. When the collectors arrived in the cities, they were met not with screams, but with stares. Empty eyes. Mothers handing over infants like they were handing over dead leaves. In some villages, the collectors found no children at all, only graves freshly dug, marked with stone spirals and curses. Parents had chosen death over sacrifice. Some had poisoned their own bloodlines. The breathless had not disappeared. They had gone underground. Somehow, they had infiltrated the temple guards, poisoned the census scrolls, replaced the priestly inks with tainted glyphs, symbols designed not to praise the gods, but to curse them. And then came the night of the final offering. Thousands were gathered around the new pit. Children lined up in white robes. The priests stood atop the obsidian altar, chanting louder than ever, louder than human throats should allow. But the pit did not open. The glyphs did not glow. Instead, they cracked. Hairline fractures raced across the obsidian floor. A sickly green smoke began to rise, not from the pit, but from beneath the temple itself. Something else had been growing. A fungus. A network. A creeping intelligence that hadn't been there before. Something left behind by the entity. A residue of thought. A contagion of belief. The priests began to convulse. Bleed from their eyes. Fall to their knees, not in worship, but in torment. Then the children began to sing. Not a melody. Not a chant. Just a tone. One long, droning note. Rising, piercing, unstoppable. One of the elder priests, his jaw unhinged, tongue black with rot, screamed, "It has turned us into a mirror. We looked into the gods too long, and now they look back." And then the pit collapsed inward, folding into itself with a scream that tore across the valley like thunder trapped in stone. The temple of offering was gone. Not destroyed. Erased. Not a stone remained. Not a priest. Not a child. Just a blackened, circular scar in the earth, smooth as glass, as if the temple had never existed. And that was the last blood tax ever collected in Tartessos. The kingdom fell within a year. The priesthood disbanded, or simply vanished. Famine turned to plague. Cities emptied. Roads overgrown. The capital swallowed by sand and time. And history? History buried it all. No conqueror came. No outside empire claimed the land. Tartessos was not conquered. It was consumed. And forgotten. Except for whispers. A handful of fragments. Forbidden chronicles buried in cliffside caves. And the occasional nightmare of a spiraled pit that still calls your name. Centuries passed. The ruins of Tartessos became legend. Stories told by wandering tribes. Warnings whispered by shepherds. And cautionary tales carved into stone far beyond the kingdom's borders. But deep beneath the cracked earth, the legacy of the blood tax lingered. In forgotten tunnels and collapsed temples, archaeologists in modern times would uncover strange artifacts. Obsidian shards etched with spirals that seemed to shift under the light, skeletons arranged in ritual poses, and fragments of that dead dialect spoken by the priests. Some of these relics defied explanation. Structures carved with impossible geometry. Moss-covered altars with traces of an unknown, phosphorescent substance. And always, faint echoes, low vibrations felt more than heard, emanating from deep underground. These echoes are sometimes dismissed as natural phenomena, but others whisper that they are remnants of the entity itself, a voice trapped between worlds, still hungry, still waiting. No one knows what lies beneath the earth now. Whether the entity remains imprisoned, dormant, or something worse, free and hungry, is a question historians and occultists debate in hushed tones. Some believe Tartessos was not a kingdom lost to time, but a warning, that in paying their blood tax, they forged a gateway, a wound in the world's fabric that can never fully heal. That some sacrifices are not just offerings, but invitations, and that the mouth beneath the world still hungers. Perhaps it calls to you now. If you listen closely, when the wind is right, you might hear it. A whisper, a spiral song, a voice that promises salvation or annihilation. Because in Tartessos, the gods were never gods. They were monsters. And monsters never forget. If this story unsettled you, left you questioning what lies beneath the surface of history, then please subscribe for more journeys into the dark corners of our past. Leave a comment. What do you think the entity truly was? And what would you sacrifice to keep it silent? For more shocking tales that blur the line between myth and reality, watch our next video now. Remember, the past is never truly gone. It's only waiting.